So thank you very much indeed. So I'm sitting here from Copenhagen, and I think this presentation I will focus on two chapters in my professional life, and some of it will also include methods of creative activism, but I also will try to put a broader view into to social movements and also generally civil society, and highlight this is from a Danish perspective, so it can be very different from other countries and environments compared to what I'm going to say here. But I mean, my presentation will look into two chapters in my life. I mean, from the activist point of view and from the donor's point of view, or you could say from the operations or from the people who pay the operations, because I will focus on my time as an activist, but also on my time as working in a foundation. So that will be the focus. But let me begin with the first chapter. So in 2011, I joined a movement called Rapolitics. It's a Danish hip hop culture movement, organization that use tools from hip hop to strengthening young people's attitude, self-esteem, and political courage. Rapolitics has more than 50 artists involved and 100 volunteers, and are doing workshops and educational training in more than 200 schools a year. We also do trainings in prisons, municipalities, platform for citizens in vulnerable positions, and so on. The Colombian rap group Asilo 38 have said that hip hop is to analyze a reality that is invisible to powerful elites and to document a history that has not yet been written. And I would say that that's also a huge part of why I was involved in Rapolitics. I was myself a musician at an academy for musicians. I basically dropped out after 2 months because I missed the combination of music and society. And in 2011, I took part in Cairo in Middle East during the Arab Spring there, and experienced some of the most active voices in the revolution were generally hip hop artists. And I will never forget a day I had in a studio in Cairo, where I would say the strongest rappers and artists were gathered and recorded new tracks manifesting the protest and the revolution, and where the regime didn't have any idea of the places, of these places as fundamental platforms for resistance, but also for creating political narratives of the future. So the recording studio basically became one of the strongest civil society platforms in a period where the normal civil society were closed down. These artists also created some of the most attended concerts in the street during the protest, and I was just highly fascinated of the power of art in that sense. Of course, that experience cannot be transformed into a Danish context, but these experiences were truly inspiring, and therefore I became involved in Rapolitics when I came back to Denmark, and took part in a journey in that movement for the next 10 years. So generally, I would say that working with hip-hop as a creative tool is quite complex, because the mobilization of hip-hop as a social movement and as a tool for oppressed and marginalized groups often seem to make their mark in form of opposition to more commercialized part of the rap scene. And these discussions about genre and purpose also complicate the work with rap music in social projects, because part of hip-hop culture is run by socially committed people who often believe that the music industry has compromised the basic ideals of hip-hop. In Rapolitics, we combined that sort of both ways. We try to pull in another direction through hip-hop artists, or rap artists as we also call them. We exploit social transformative forces and the political agency in the notion of hip-hop as a cultural force that can strengthen young people's desire and encourage for democratic participation. And working in that way has been quite liberalizing, since we have also held focus on the mechanism within hip-hop that can get the marginalized youth to be accepted and to take part as active democratic citizens. And I would say, as a general note, in Denmark, we have huge problems within the youth that doesn't believe that their voices will contribute to anything in democracy. So hip hop at some point can make all voices heard. If you can speak, you can learn to turn it into rhythms. And when you do have learned that, you can basically learn to rap. It has never been important about talent or creating a career. That's also what was so fascinating for me to take part in it, because it was always about trying to contribute to create ways and methods and platforms for many more young people to take part in democratic innovation in Denmark. And within the 10 years I took part in the organization, we also became part of a tendency I see a lot in Denmark, in both in social movements and also in civil society platforms, where activists increasingly are hired to do bigger projects for the state or for the municipality to activate young people. And I acknowledge the importance of a stronger cooperation with activism, with movements such as Rapolitics, with, for example, the state or the public sector. But of course, it also touches upon a tendency I see a lot, that activist movements basically becomes organization which operations are funded by the ones they are criticizing. And maybe it's not a problem if it at the end creates social, political, economical change. This is still difficult to measure, though, because the long-term effects of what an organization like Rapolitics do is quite difficult to measure. This is not new, and I guess an area that all of you had looked into in some way. But for me, it still explains one of the reasons why we see so many movements that are turned into professionals organizations, where they suddenly become part of a change reaction, or how you would say that are quite different from what their main purpose were from the beginning. And I think this is also connected at some point to what some surveys have shown, that there are high numbers of burnouts in activist environments. And I personally experienced in the last couple of years in Rapolitics that the energy of being a movement that have turned into a more professional organization that suddenly used all of our time on applications for funds and meeting with the public sector and the state, had huge effects on our main purposes and goal. And again, maybe that doesn't have to be a problem, but it became more difficult for us to create sustainable and dynamic environments with volunteer communities and members, instead of suddenly being a movement that had to act on topics that were highlighted from state or within strategies from the foundation. So this is an issue that I think in a Danish case is not often talked about, but I would say I see all the time, and I think is something that we have to discuss much more. And that at some point leads the way into chapter 2, because in 2021 I finished my time in Rapolitics, been involved there for 10 years, both as an educator, an activist, taking part in demonstration, board member, head of organization. And I somehow finished a bit burned out of taking part in a movement that constantly were suddenly and constantly seeking for funds. And my general experience was that even though that the civil society in Denmark is vibrant and resourceful, I had this feeling that especially the youth within this sector really were struggling to create long-term resource impact and also a sustainable life, taking part in a movement. So at some point I became curious on how you can build strong capacity and sustainable structures for movement. And that was probably why I in 2022 got the idea of trying to work on the other side of the table. And in that year, I began in a foundation called Tuborg Foundation, which is a foundation within Carlsberg Foundation. And we in Tuborg Foundation support youth organizations with around $25 million a year. And we basically financially support, I would say, most of the strong youth movements that are in Denmark. And we support a lot of social movements that are working within the field of creative activism. And my main purpose of changing roles and switch to the opposite side of the table, you could say, to the power, to the money, was to see what change is possible to drive from that position. Also taking into consideration that I have a background from activist environment, from civil society, which is still quite rarely in a foundation in Denmark. So in Denmark, I would say we generally have a quite strong relationship between civil society, the movement within civil society, the public sector, and the foundation. And that's probably both good and bad. Some of the strongest youth creative activist movement in Denmark, it could be the Green Student Movement or the Movement for Youth Refugees. They have also in the last years turned into organization with financials, operations, and quite professional operations, still on the street, but are with a much more focus on operation. And I think it's a quite interesting tendency. I would assume could happen all around the world, but I also think is quite exceptional in Denmark, maybe because of the financial capacities. And in my position, I really get an insight into a lot of movements, and I will here at the end highlight two main issues that I almost see certain for every activist movement in Denmark. And one of them is that it's really difficult to capacity build in a highly changing society, where both activists are involved in a more hybrid way from case to case, and in a position where even the volunteer sector has experienced some sort of radical change, where it's difficult to commit over a longer period, and where there are many examples on activists that suddenly want to also become a paid staff. And I understand the reason why, and I've tried it myself, but I find this development as a huge challenge for democratic innovation in Denmark. And the other issue I would highlight is that data on cases of the potential way of creating a change for creative activist movements and bolster mobilization is still quite vague in Denmark, maybe not within the universities where Silas work from, but within the civil society, it's quite vague, and that has huge effect on possibilities for these movements to become sustainable, because the narrative is a bit uncertain, since the outcome and effects are still unclear at some point. And what I try to do from a foundation point of view is to try to work with these movements in the most honest way as possible, accepting the challenging of the power, but try to find models with long-term, models where these movements can find long-term existence, both in terms of securing stronger data, partnerships, corporations, building platforms for or building sustainable platform, but also in terms of how they can take part in a life within this organization that they can live in, that they can be in for many years. And another focus I will have in that sentence is to create, how can you say, to centralize different setups, so we can see many more movements that where the back end, where their operations are centralized and run by a platform, so it can release the energy to still be an activist and take part in a movement instead of running operations. And this, I would say, is some of it's a huge topic and issue in Denmark now, and this is a discussion that I really is trying to highlight, and I try to take this discussion with a lot of organization, but also with scholars out there, and that's also why I'm really glad to take part in this session to try to highlight this perspective from a Danish point of view, and also to get a much better insight on what your experience are from different cases in countries, and how you look upon this issue, which I will only see become even bigger in a Danish case the next many years. So I think on that note, I will finish off from here.
Thank you, Mathias. That was great. Thank you so much. That was so rich. So many questions. I will open the floor if anybody wants to just jump in. Go ahead, please.
I'm going to just start, Mathias. Thank you, first of all, for that. And I think you do have a unique perspective because you were working on the activist side and now you're on the other side as well. And that's really interesting to hear about, particularly the professionalization of activism. I think it is something that happens here in the United States as well. Not government funded, but grant funded. But now in this other position where you're a grantor, I'm intrigued by you say, well, the lack of data that would be useful for you as a funder to know about creative forms of activism. Can you get a little bit more specific? Like what data, now that you sit in this position, could you say, I would really like to know about, say, Rapolitics or any creative activism that you don't have access to?
So this is the difficult part, Steve, because if we take Rapolitics as a movement, the long-term effect is really difficult to measure because we are on a really personal scale. So you can, of course, have an educational training in a school where you can say that after the session, you could see that 4 or 5 of the young students that were not involved in the class at all were suddenly much more involved. And after that session, they became suddenly a huge part of the class again. So that's, of course, that's possible. But in terms of showing the movement within the movement, the data there, how all these artists that are involved there, what sort of effects does that have on them out there in their career? Because a lot of these artists are also from vulnerable positions. I think that's also part of the genre, that a lot of rappers or people that work within hip-hop culture comes from marginalized societies. But it can be really difficult. And I just experienced that when there are invited cases to this foundation to discuss their methods, it's still difficult for them to show the long-term effect. They can show the outcome, but on a society, on a level of a society where we really see the bigger funds. I've just realized that it's difficult in Denmark, and probably there's in many other countries you're much more far ahead in terms of that, I would assume. But I also experience when I challenge them on the narrative, it becomes a bit difficult for them to go further than their main purpose. I mean, what are this doing in terms of the greater society, which a lot of foundations like to hear, because they want to contribute to the greater impact in the society. So, I mean, it's specialists like you that knows what sort of data would be the right one. I just see a huge lack of it.
Anybody else want to jump in? Silas?
Yeah, just wondering if you can hear somebody singing in the house, but I hope you can't hear it. I mean, yes, we know each other, but I was wondering, and thanks for your presentation here. You mentioned at the end that you're working with models, you call it, in the foundation now for how to secure good partnerships, better data, as Steve was asking about. But also, thirdly, you mentioned sustainability. And I think that's yet another challenge for a lot of creative artistic activism, is that it's often sort of, in some cases anyways, it's a single one-trick ponies, if you like, happenings. And in some cases, it is more valuable if it is more sustainable. So I'm just wondering how you are working from a foundational point of view with creating sustainability for the young activists that you are supporting.
So I can give an example. So last week I had a meeting with a quite strong. It's a social movement here in Copenhagen, and they have a lot of. They do a lot of activities. And they came into the meeting here and were highlighting, I mean, this huge milestone of, I mean, hundreds of activities a year. But at some point I also thought, okay, this is insanely stressful to do all of these activities. And instead, after honest discussion, we realized that they also had that feeling, that they had too much focus on doing activities all the time to get people involved, but their baseline or the work, the ground where they were working from, the operations were not running at all. They had a huge problem with sick leave and I mean, huge problems in the operations. And instead, we completely deleted all the activities, and then we focused on creating a model where we at some point identified a long-term plan for them, a long-term strategy in terms of what sort of people should you cooperate, what sort of cooperation should you create, what sort of data is important for you to get to become stronger in terms of getting long-term investment. What sort of organizational structure should you have in terms of your volunteers? What sort of role should the members have? And this was actually something that they didn't had talked that much or worked that much on. Instead of they've been focused on mobilizing the activists out on the street, but was also something that were completely stressful for them. But again, this is complex because the activities is also the DNA of the organization. So if we suddenly say, let's focus the next 3 years on organizational structure and not focus on activities, it can also become really difficult for them, because how will you keep on mobilizing a narrative and a movement if you focus only on operation? And this is difficult, but this is something that we look a lot into. And sometimes it makes sense, sometimes it doesn't make sense for a movement. It depends.
Thank you, Mathias. Anybody else want to jump in? If not, I have a question myself. I was very interested in asking you about the relationship with the state and how that there's usually in this narrative of, you know, philanthropy and funders, that whenever there is a connection to policy, it's something that's gained, right? When there's an impact on policy change, or there's an impact in the institution that's lasting, that's a marker of success. How does that manifest itself with the movements that you worked? Is that something that has been demystified in one way or another, or is there some insights in terms of like what that really means now? Because at the end, you know, it gets measured in number of meetings with the minister, or, you know, or events where both logos appear. And is there a bit of knowledge on that kind of partnerships?
I mean, my general feeling the last 5-10 years is that it has been completely demystified. I mean, whereas 10 years ago, where I worked at Rapolitics, it was really something that we were that was difficult for us, and a lot of our members and the community were a bit afraid of this. But now I see some of the biggest social movements in Copenhagen that just runs into daily meetings at the government and at the bigger foundations. So I would say that this has been demystified a lot. And I also experienced that at my time in Rapolitics, that we realized that to run this sort of work and to do this work that is really where we really need a lot of resources, we have to talk to the people who can fund operations like this. Otherwise, it will become quite difficult. But I would say, Mauricio, that we lost some people in that journey. That there were some people that said this is not for us anymore. That you now are running after the money instead of the main purpose. And then you could say you can have a main purpose and still run after the money, but some people you will lose some people in that way. And I'm not saying that there's a best way to do it, but I think this is a huge challenge for every social movement. Where should they put themselves in that sort of journey?
Thank you so much.
And
Yeah,
this is Mei Qing. Related with what Mauricio was asking is, I am also curious about like the relationship between the state and the capitalism as embodied in creative activism. I wonder whether like the state has firm control of capitalism or the other way around in Denmark.
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult to answer, because I would say that capitalism is involved all around, also within a lot of the strong social movements. I mean, and it also depends on how you define capitalism in that way. As I said before, I just see that a lot of movements are looking into where they can fund, where they can get funds from. And that, I think, is a huge change, that you can see really strong local communities that have had a main agenda and a main purpose. And then after a year, suddenly they also want to get funding. Where I would assume that many years ago, this was not the case. You stayed in the local, with the local focus, and it was completely run voluntarily with members. And it was not, you were not interested at all in receiving funds, but this has just changed a lot. And I think the whole system has changed, and it has also changed that the state in Denmark are much more involved in civil society. They pay a lot of money out in the civil society, and of course the civil society will follow where the strategies are going from the state. That's for sure.
Anybody else? Oh, Stephen, go ahead.
Let's just follow up on that question from a slightly different angle, but it's about capitalism. In your analysis of why, one, the state has gotten involved at the level of civil society, but two, also why volunteerism has decreased, whereas professionalism has increased. And I'm wondering about precarity on the part of young people and professionals, where you do have to figure out how to make a living, because it's just harder to make a living now. And so if someone offers you a nonprofit job, you take it, because the things that were available to your parents' generation are no longer available. I don't know, just putting within kind of the capitalist marketplace, does that help us understand a little bit about what's happening both at the level of the state, but also the level of the individual?
So first of all, Steve, the state have always, in a Danish case, been quite involved, because we have a welfare society. So that's the model, that the state are much more involved and are close to the public sector. But there's also a tendency in Denmark the last couple of years that we much more want to work with like system change. We want to work with the broader system, and therefore we have to to cooperate with the public and the private and the state much more. So that's really a tendency I see a lot. And there's a lot of good things about that, but there's also, of course, problematic things about that. The other thing is that I would say the whole civil, I mean, the small organization in Denmark, they are all precarious. I mean, it's all precarity, and it's and that's having a huge effect on volunteer environments. Actually, in the social sector in Denmark, we still have a lot of volunteers, and maybe it's also more easy with the social sector because the issues that are involved there are so easygoing. I mean, they are just out there, everyday things we can help with. Whereas in the general civil society, in the creative sector, it can be much more difficult to mobilize volunteers because a lot of people working in the creative sector are living in a precarious situation, therefore want to find some sort of a daily way of living, and therefore it becomes difficult to create volunteer environments that are sustainable, because most people in the creative sector have to go the way where they can earn something. And where my guess would be in Denmark, a lot that works in the social, that are volunteer in the social sector, that is not connected to their daily work. It's something they do beside the work. But when it comes to the creative sector, it's much more intertwined. And yeah, I would say that's really a problem. And we see some of the big cultural platforms where 5-7 years ago had a lot of volunteers. They find it very, very difficult to mobilize people today if there aren't a salary to pay.
Yeah, I'd like to follow up with the idea you brought up is about the precarity, or is it called precarious or being precarious? I do realize, or have actually learned from researchers that become an increasing kind of condition for many young people, and especially people who work in a creative industry, right? That because they're expected to be creative. By being creative, meaning they can work 24 hours or anytime, right? And so that indeed has kind of, I think, really limit. I think I would say limit, or really kind of maybe negatively really disabled many people's enthusiasm in kind of creative activism. Once they get into it, then they realize that that's so hard and so underpaid, right? The contribution, the time, creativity is so underpaid. And it's definitely fascinating to know that in Denmark is also the case, because I think that would be more common in China, and the creative industry where they are exploited by the state and also by capitalism. But so I don't know. I think so related with that, now volunteers seek to be paid, right, to work. Maybe that's a kind of progress. I don't know, a progress, right? A development.
Maybe I'm not sure. Maybe it's really positive. The only thing I can see is that it affects the idea that you can contribute outside of the field of capitalism or earning money. That there is something that are much more valuable, and that is the contribution in society outside of the normal system. At some point, that you are involved in an initiative because it's a good initiative. There's not any other way. You're just involved in that because it makes sense. You don't have to think about what you'll earn or how many hours it is and so on, because it's just it's the case. You need to be there. And I would say that I experience that this has been challenged a lot in the creative sector. That these sort of mobilizations is very difficult today.
I hear you, definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely, it's yeah, it's not productive in a sense, right? For what we really hope to see, like a democratic innovation, right? So when we have like the professionalization of activism, they become a profession, joining the establishment, and then
Definitely. And I think I mean, the most interesting case for me in Denmark is the green youth movement, which is they are a really strong activist movement. But now they are also doing huge operations, so they have a completely another setup compared to like 5-7 years ago. And I'm not sure if that's positive. I don't know yet, but it's a really interesting development that that these sort of activist movements that are so important and are very, very clear in our communities and our societies suddenly also has to apply for bigger funds and bigger foundations. What's your take on that, Silas?
I agree. I was just thinking that it seems like some of what we're talking about is also sort of the lifespan of a movement and of the individual activist as well. I was wondering, Mathias, if you can give examples of when you choose as a foundation not to support particular creative activists because your analysis is that it's actually better for them, depending where they are at in their development, not to be paid for by you.
So there are many cases on this, actually. A clear example I see a lot is a movement that submit an application, or we do it in a bit another way, because in our foundation you submit a short pitch, because we don't want to take too much time of your daily work if it's not possible to get it through our board. But I see a lot of pitches with a budget. Let's say it's for 3 years, and the budget is huge. I mean, and then there are no plan on how you will continue after the project period. And the problem with that is that then you build up maybe, let's say, $1 million over 3 years. You build up a really maybe strong community with volunteer environment and a staff and different sort of corporations, but then there are no plan of how you will succeed, and if it's possible to succeed with such funds after that project period. And then you actually risk to build up a community for a target group which cannot which cannot continue after the project period, and then you suddenly lose the whole target group. You suddenly lose the people there, because you have built up a narrative and a way to active take part, which will not be there after 3 years. And this I see all the time. It's a dream. They want to receive a huge grant, but then afterwards, what will happen? And that is really the danger for some of the social movement I see, that they suddenly want to build up this huge platform instead of just instead of just working on that energy that were from the beginning. It is said with an understanding that I understand where this come from, and I understand that people want to create a secretariat with staffs and so on, but still, yeah.
I had a question about exactly this idea of scale, right? Scaling up. And I was very intrigued on the this idea of a centralized administration, sort of like a hub that takes care of a number of things that organizations, you know, the overhead, the fiscal sponsorship, the formalization, all these different things that come into that environment. I'm wondering if you have experience with like or if you can mention some examples where that is actually working, and if that's being tested or experimented with, because one of the things that I'm from Peru and Latin America, the saying goes that if you want to destroy a movement, just give them money, right? You give money, and the level of the ability to handle all these different things that come with money, including transparency, becomes an issue, right? And so I'm curious as to how you see if movements are ready in this sort of like what appears to be a more dense ecology of movements in terms of the relationship in Denmark, or that sort of ecosystem. Do you find that is it happening already? Is it more likely to happen? Or what are the hurdles to conceive of that new model? Because it really is a different way of understanding that relationship to resources, right? And
yeah, it's a really good question, Mauricio. So I see this, we have a lot of discussions about this. There are some initiatives out there that are trying this out, and we also will have now a new civil society house where they will have that, and there's also a community house in an area of Copenhagen where they have like 6-7 different organizations, but with the whole back end centralized and so on, and it works very well. But I acknowledge that this is difficult to build up, and you need some sort of financial structure to do this, but that's something that we find quite interesting, that's for sure. And I think we will see much more cases on this and much more models on how you could do that, because we want to, we want to give out the good energy that was in the movement, and that energy is sometimes destroyed by operation. So we are really interested in this, and I guess we will see that in many countries where foundations are willing to support that. I'm not saying in terms of that all the movement that receive money will be destroyed. I'm not saying that, because we support a lot of movements that succeed with money to create really, really strong change out in the society. I just think that this is discussion that we in a Danish case doesn't take that much, and we should talk much more about it, and we should also highlight for movement that it's not always the answer.
Right, thank you. Stephen.
So it kind of, in many ways it makes sense for these social organizations to want to build staff to support themselves, partly precarity on their own part, partly for continuity, partly for this idea of expansion and scaling. I think we've talked about all that. But I think you're right, is what ends up happening is you start to think like an organization and stop thinking like a social movement. Yet money is good, longevity is good, scale is good. Have you come across alternative models for doing those things, stability, scale, and continuity, that don't follow the government funding or private foundation funding, make yourself into an organization model?
There are actually quite a lot of examples in Denmark, and the best examples are the places where there are a lot of like small social companies involved that already have their, I would say, their financial case. They know what they can do, and they know that they can do it on their own, and they can meet together with a lot of other organizations that have the same DNA. So they have found, the good case where they can actually rest on their main purpose and earn money from it, but still, but still work into a broader platform. And we see many cases on that. And I actually think there's a lot of companies that are quite strong, much stronger than civil society organizations in thinking of long-term securement without without public support or financial support from foundations. There's a couple. There's a lot of good examples in this, both in Copenhagen and Aarhus, in Jutland in Denmark, and so on. So definitely, and I have always said to a lot of civil society organization, that they should have much more network meetings with companies, because there would be a lot they could learn from that side, just as companies could learn, or the private sector could learn a lot from civil society, because civil society is so strong on working with the target group. I mean, they know the case, they know the cause, they know the main purpose here and the main target group. So I think just we should create much stronger network and discussion between these sectors, because I think they will benefit from it.
Thank you, Mathias. Anybody who wants to jump in? Mei-Cheng, go ahead.
Yeah, just something just occurred to me is like, so I think as was already been discussed, is like how to position, how an organization or a movement position yourself, right? So maybe it is like the idea of longevity, we want to last long. This idea itself might not be productive, or what we want to last is our spirit, or us as an organization, right? If we want to sustain forever as an organization, that means you have to think about the money, the funding, the sustainability. So you want to have like the staff you can be paid, because you have secretary who can pay and take care of all the business. And that, I think, is naturally in conflict with if you want the kind of innovative, creative spirit to last, right? So maybe the way I'm looking at isn't necessary for the organization or a movement to last. Or once the cause is like the target is being achieved, maybe we just finish and we move on and keep the spirit.
Yep.
So it's interesting to talk about the end. I like this idea of the life cycle of longevity. Talk about like good deaths, good deaths of certain things, and what does that mean to wrap up?
Right.
Or because I think there's a lot to learn there, right? About also this, there's certain syndromes of like founder syndrome, right? People that found something that just intergenerationally, doesn't switch leadership and all of that stuff, right? So I think it's an interesting to think about it as a life cycle.
Yeah, exactly.
Steven, yeah. Anybody else? We have only 8 minutes if we want to be compliant with time.
I'm curious, do you have any cases on movement that you have looked into, worked with, or that have managed to find a good balance, that have that still have kept their strong DNA, but have also received a lot of funds, have built up a strong operation, are still creating results, are still creating impact, that really have found a balance?
I mean, I think that at the center, this is exactly Center for Artistic Activism. This is exactly what we're trying to figure out.
Yeah.
It is sort of going from a founder-based, scrappy, subsidized, by the way, and then transitioning to an executive director-led staff organization. I think time will tell to see how successful that is. I mean, in terms of longevity, yes, we made the transition from founders to an organization. In terms of sort of creating stability, yes, we've been able to do that. And in scope and scale, we've been able to expand into areas we've never been able to expand at. Do we think more like an organization than we do like a social movement service kind of apparatus? Probably, because there's a certain necessity to that. So I don't know, time will tell. The good death, I mean, I was part of a social movement organization in the 1990s, and I think that's exactly like what we tried to do, is die well. Is after 2.5 years, we just realized that it was either going to professionalize or die. And so like, well, let's just kill it off.
I like the idea of dying well. I think that movement, that there's a lot of, I mean, there could be more movement that should accept the idea of dying well at some point. That it's not like it's not like to lose, but it's okay.
Yeah.
I think just to stay in the Danish context, for me, one example of what you're asking for, Mathias, is actually the alternative, the political movement that went into becoming a political party that I was part of starting up. I was part of the board there. Is an example of, for me, how important leadership is in terms of trying to strike that balance, or rather keep moving sort of the pendulum between one end of the scale to the other, to keep that dynamic. When Uffe Elbæk, as he's called, the initial political leader, left, so did the energy of the movement. And instead of acknowledging that it started up as a sort of entrepreneurial project that had one goal, and as that goal was actually in one sense achieved, it should have died well. And instead it was sort of clinging on to power, which have now had tragic consequences, and is still living, but in such an not in a very honorable manner. So yes, I think dying well is a big part of creative activism, and again acknowledging that there's sort of a life cycle, and a lot of what we're talking about depends on where we are in that sort of cycle.
The last small question, maybe just for 1 minute. Do you think, now all of you have worked with creative activism for many years, do you think that the creative sector is more vulnerable in terms of this sort of, way of looking much more after funds and foundation, instead of like being in having focus on the main purpose, that like this sort of journey? Or is it just something you see generally, or do you think this is also connected to the precarious state of mind?
I think that's a great question. I think, as was brought up earlier, the precarity of creative people kind of lend themselves, I think, to actually wanting some sort of stability in a way that maybe people in social work don't need, or in other sectors. I also think that there may be a larger mismatch between the creative sector and the organizational sector, which creates greater stresses, and pulls people away from their original mission and their style of doing things, which really isn't true for, say, a labor organization, which has a model which actually can graft pretty well onto the state or onto foundational work. It's just a hypothesis. To be tested by all of us.
Yeah, exactly.